Hi, welcome back. This is the Forms of Poetry lecture. It's also going to be one part. I guarantee it. It's going to be super short, and we'll build up on the stuff that I'm talking about in this video on Tuesday. There's just two things I want to go over. One is the line, and the other is the stanza, which is really just a collection of lines. So let's start. All right. So as it says here, the line is the basic unit of poetry. When we talked about fiction, we talked about the scene as the basic unit of fiction, of storytelling. It will also end up being the basic unit in some ways of nonfiction. But for poetry, the basic unit is the line. They're the building blocks of a poem. And a line can be defined as a series of words ended by a typographical break. We're going to see some options here, but that's all it is. It's just a string of words that end, and then, it's the thing that makes poetry what poetry is and not prose, that ending of it. It's like a framing device in a way, as we'll see. And lines, like on their own, should employ rhythm and sound. They don't have to have strict meter, like da 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 da, and they don't have to have rhyme like traditional poems. But they still have some sort of sense of the rhythm of the words, of the syllables, and the sounds as they echo off each other. So there are two ways to break your lines. One is called end stopping. We've talked about this briefly, but let's go into it in depth, which is breaking a line with a punctuation mark, a comma, a period, question mark, a dash. You'll see Emily Dickinson loves the dash. That's her chief end-stopping mechanism. What it does is it allows a line to stand on its own somewhat. It breaks it off from the rest of the poem and just asks us readers to consider this line on its own a bit. Whereas enjambment breaks a line without any punctuation, just leaves the word hanging there with the white space after it. And what this does is it forces the line into a kind of juxtaposition with its neighbors, usually what comes after, but also a little bit from what comes before. So the last line of the last word of the line will resonate, but also link up and sort of jump to what's coming. So we can see examples of this in the E. E. Cummings poem. Here's this: "Thy fingers make early flowers of." This is the whole first stanza of the piece, and you can see the mix of end stops here, a parenthesis to end stop, and enjambment, right? "Thy fingers make early flowers of all things." That "of" just sort of hangs out there, which is interesting, of all words to put it out there, but it's like a kind of, almost like a cliff, I don't know, it's like a precipice or something, that brings us to this sort of short, direct "all things." "Thy hair mostly the hours love, a smoothness which sings." Again, another weird word that's not very emphatic or interesting, but that hangs out there as a kind of way to bring us to this "sings." And this is all sort of Cummings' stylistic choices of sort of white spaces and everything. Saying, again, sort of leaping right into the next line, "Though love be a day, do not fear we will go a-maying." And we'll come back to some of these Cummings poems in a bit. But those are your options: end stopping them and jamming them. Go for a mix, vary your rhythms. Even Emily Dickinson, who seems like every line should be end stopped, she'll enjam some every now and then, just as a kind of, just to mix it up and sort of have this tension of rhythm. And speaking of tension, the idea here is to force the tension between sentence and line. So the question you're asking as a poet is, how can you break a sentence up to call attention to its parts and see the way that these sentences are broken up by white space, by line breaks, to draw attention to certain words that, for whatever reason, Cummings wants us to linger on just a little bit. Okay, so that is all I want to say about the line for now. There's also the stanza, which is just defined as basically the division of lines in a poem. For some reason, I'm starting with white spaces and blank space, so let's do that, because you see a lot of it in Cummings too. Poems are visually coded. We talked about this last week, I think, and the ways in which a poem presents itself on the page as a poem. Look how short I am. Look how I'm in this weird little box. I'm a poem, not a piece of prose. Read me accordingly. This is what a poem sort of broadcasts to you. And the way it does that is by white space. You can have white space before words, such as here, which is, it's kind of like indenting, right? You can have them afterwards, which is basically what a line break is. It's just inserting white space after a word. And then you can have them kind of around words, and how this operates as a kind of picture frame, right, to sort of say, here's this word, please focus on it. A lot of poets, Cummings uses it a whole lot, but other poets, you know, I think one of the Frank O'Hara poems we read last week also had a certain like use of white space and indenting to kind of create certain effects. So with a poet, as a poet, you're pretty free to do whatever you want with white space, and to just be attuned to the effect that white space has in the line. The stanza, getting into that, is defined as a division of lines in a poem. And it's usually patterned and usually repeated. There's a kind of metric. Often you'll see when writers use stanzas, for instance here, they're 3 7-line stanzas, right? It's repeated and it's a certain, you can see a kind of pattern here. Other poems don't have that pattern, but it's important for you to be aware of whether to adopt a pattern of stanzas or work against it, and when and how. And we can talk about that in class and looking at future poems. So the question you ask as a poet is, how many lines before you leave a space? And it's up to you. Here's some vocab. If you got 2 lines, you're working with couplets, 3 lines, tercets, 4 lines, all that. You can learn those, and we'll talk more about that in this week. But to sort of give you an idea of this, of how the stanza works, I want to look at this example. This is a line from Schomburg's "Far from Marlene" that we read last week. And here's the sentence as it is. The sky is greenish yellow with some blackbirds now in it. And I've broken it up into 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 line stanzas. And look what happens to the words and the way that the sentence creates some tension with the line, depending on how you break it up. The sky is greenish yellow with some blackbirds now in it. To do it as a couplet creates a kind of natural pause here. You don't even need a comma. The white space sort of fits in where we would pause for a breath. And then here's a tercet. The sky is greenish yellow with some black birds now in it. Note how the words that are at the end of the line here, like greenish, the sky is greenish. This stands alone as a line and gives you an image of a green sky. Yet that gets complicated because it's greenish yellow. And by not putting it on that line, we're sort of surprised by that change in the color of the sky. And then with some black, right? The sky is greenish yellow with some black. So we suddenly see this color before we realize that that black is created by the birds that are now in the sky. So there's a lot going on here in this tercet with this kind of juxtaposition of the word and the line. Here you've got something neat pattern-wise. You have 4, since it's 12, these are 12 words. You have 4 lines of 3 words each. The sky is greenish yellow with some blackbirds now in it. I forced a rhythm to it, but you can see the rhythm. And then here, similarly, you've got 6 2-word stanzas. And here you've got 7 2-syllable stanzas. The sky is greenish yellow with some black birds now in it. Again, you read it as the sky is greenish yellow with some black birds now in it, but something happens here. It looks, I mean, the poetry and the rhythm of it is very, I don't know, kept intact somehow. So it's a great line, and it just shows you how many options you have with taking your sentences and your utterances and making them into lines and stanzas. For the record, this is what Schomburg, this is what he chose, is the tercet. And I think it has a really great effect. So we'll look more at this in the poems of Emily Dickinson and E.E. Cummings for this week, and I will see you all on Tuesday.